Is the newest candidate for most base Senator John Fetterman, the Pennsylvania Democrat? Well, he's seen his stock rise among conservatives for a series of takes that seem to buck the rest of his party, as well as some progressives. In fact, Fetterman has declined to identify himself as a progressive recently, something conservative commentator Ian Miles Chong pointed out that John Fetterman is now a de facto conservative. "I'm not a progressive," he now says. He previously, however, identified as a socialist. He's also slamming Democrats for their double standard on Bob Menendez, George Santos, and actually isn't up for re-election until 2028. Nature is healing. That was all according to Ian Miles Chong.
Now, earlier this week, Fetterman was confronted by pro-Palestine protesters and has had a series of incidents over the course of the last 2 months where he's come for a lot of criticism from people on the left for failure to support a ceasefire, notably leaving Congress one day while waving an American flag in the middle of a pro-ceasefire protest.
And he is on video repeatedly identifying as a progressive in the past. So the idea that he has never called himself a progressive is just factually inaccurate.
So this is how this is all going down. There's been the stuff about Israel-Palestine, and there's been some other indications from him that he is on board with supporting some more conservative immigration policy. This after he very notably was married to a woman who was an undocumented immigrant when they met, and who in his campaign materials was very complimentary of America's history of welcoming immigrants. In his campaign video, he says, "The Statue of Liberty says, send us your poor, your huddled masses. As long as we remain true to that original sentiment, America will continue to grow and prosper." So that's one area in which he seems to have done a 180. But particularly on this am I a progressive issue, look, a lot of real progressives were skeptical about him from the beginning, but appreciated that he was good on a couple of issues, and so therefore wanted to help him get into office in Pennsylvania.
And he has working class bona fides.
Well, he actually is from a very wealthy family, which is something that people criticize, that it's a kind of a cosplay that he puts on, dressing down the way he does. But he tweeted out recently an old video of him from 2022 in which he says, "I am not a progressive, I'm just a regular Democrat," seeming to stand for the proposition that he's never been a progressive and that people who wanted to put him in that box were wrong to do so. Now, that video got slapped with a community's note that included 3 different instances of John Fetterman saying, "I am a progressive," and I believe we have a video clip of one of those instances here to play.
I'm John Fetterman, and I'm a Democrat, and I'm a progressive.
All right, so for obvious reasons, progressives who worked hard to get him into office, who gave him money, who supported him as he was being attacked by the right for recovering from his stroke, are now feeling like they're thrown under the bus. And some staffers in particular, one of whom I worked with on the Bernie campaign, who works as his chief of comms, as I understand it, is getting a lot of personal blowback and calling out on the internet precisely because it's difficult to understand how a candidate can do this much of a pivot and maintain the trust and support of his staffers.
Well, obviously he can't take the position that he's never called himself a progressive because he's on camera doing so. It could be the case that he no longer identifies as a progressive. Perhaps he finds so several of these recent scuffles with progressives have been on the Israel-Palestine issue. There was him actually wearing the Israeli flag as like a cape while walking out through I believe it was through a pro-Palestinian kind of demonstration.
I think when he wore the flag, I think it's when he was attending that pro-Israel rally.
Okay.
But he was waving a flag while walking through a ceasefire.
For whatever reason, it seems, my guess is that he personally finds the activities of the pro-Palestinian activists to be alienating, and it's driving him away from what he used to call his own progressivism, although obviously he was a progressive at one point. I think maybe he just is no longer.
I don't think that there's been any shift on Israel. His district is one with a large Jewish population. I think, like many politicians across the country, that's a consideration when they decide where to come down on these kinds of policies, whether or not they're going to take money from AIPAC, whether they want to have to go up against huge AIPAC spends, like another Philly representative, Summer Lee, was almost defeated by a multi-million-dollar last-minute AIPAC spend in her district. So these are really real considerations that people have to think about. But I think that from the beginning, I think most progressives understood that he was only a partial ally and that he wasn't going to be on board with every single agenda item, and that many people, there's a kind of a saying, progressive but for Palestine, that it has often been the case that many progressives, genuine progressives in all these other issues, don't keep the line when it comes to Palestine. And it has been a really red line in American politics for a really long time. So that would make him unusual even among progressives. However, I do think it's his turn, the choice to be so openly antagonistic, I think, to the ceasefire activists, and also to make such a pivot on immigration, given that his own wife was an undocumented immigrant, seems like particularly hypocritical.
Sure. Maybe, again, it's an issue where he's just read the tea leaves. I mean, even so many Democrats, moderate voters, independents, in addition to virtually all Republicans, so upset with Biden's handling of immigration and the border issue, perceived vulnerability on that issue if you don't speak up against it.
I mean, it's interesting. One Twitter user, she's a grassroots organizer, Alexandra Hunt, pointed out that it's not only that his own wife, and I think also one of her or both of her parents were undocumented before they met each other, and I think he enabled them to become documented, partly because of his stature as an elected official. She pointed out Fetterman has never been progressive, but endorsing talks for tougher immigration laws when he's married to an incredible woman who was once an illegal immigrant and who kept his campaign alive while he was recovering from a stroke is actually sickening. I mean, just on a human level, I do think that is a narrative that he's going to have trouble working through. And whether or not he's able to, I mean, as we pointed out in the read, he is not up for re-election for a long time. Who knows how long people's memories are, but I'm really doubtful that he's going to get any of the progressive support that he got last time around.
Sure, although I don't know, is that hypocrisy? I mean, I know that there are many immigrants, including, I think, undocumented immigrants who they've got in and now support harsher
it's a common, I would argue, not especially ethical choice, but it's a very common thing to want to pull the ladder up behind you and support policies only insofar as they help you, and no matter who else they hurt. So yeah, that is regrettably a pretty common position to have. I mean, so what do you make of this? Someone like E. Miles Chong rushing out to throw their arms around John Fetterman is giving me the same sort of vibe as these MSNBC pundits running to embrace someone like Liz Cheney because they say a couple of things that are aligned with the Democratic Party's interest. Do you think this is premature, or is Fetterman really based?
Based is a mindset and a mentality, and based literally on the comments you make and how willing you are to trigger progressive people, excuse me. So he is based in that sense. This is just a reaction to the liberal tears are delicious to me, which is a lot of what passes for conservative media commentary these days. I'd point out that I think a lot of his policies haven't substantially changed. Now, there's a shift going on in the Republican Party to be at least performatively more working class, and also there's a change happening on trade and that's been underway for 10 years now with Donald Trump's takeover of the Republican Party. I saw recently that I think just yesterday, Fetterman joined J.D. Vance and some other Republicans in criticizing this purchase of a U.S. steel company by a Japanese company, which is something that I think conservatives, free market Republicans would be totally fine with, and now they've turned against that in part because of Trump. Maybe many Fetterman-style Democrats would have always opposed it, but it's this kind of strange new consensus that has emerged. Actually, J.D. Vance is a good example of how this has changed, because in his book, Hillbilly Elegy, he specifically writes about how his grandfather, his pawpaw, was outraged about the Japanese becoming more involved in the local steel manufacturing because it was all World War II veterans who literally, wanted to kill the Japanese. But actually, Papa comes to realize, and so does the town, that it was good for the economics of the town to have this massive investment from the Japanese in it. And now he's just totally gone against that. So I know we probably disagree on this issue.
What do you make of everybody pivoting like that? J.D. Vance is someone who also has written critically of Medicare, the social welfare state, Social Security and Medicare, and is now talking about how we have to preserve it.
Yeah.
You mentioned that
I like
in his
the old
book.
version.
Right, but that's the problem. There are all these versions, and something similar is happening with Fetterman. Comparisons have been made to Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin now that Fetterman is having this pivot. Who knows how far it's going to go, if that's a premature characterization. But I mean, what are the American people supposed to think when these politicians run for office on one platform and one ideology, and then suffer no consequences when there's a pretty pronounced pivot in what they say that they stand for? Isn't this exactly why so many people, especially younger people, are disaffected with politics and choosing increasingly to stay home or vote completely outside of the two-party system?
Well, with people like, Sinema and Manchin, their issue is they pivot because they want to be the Democratic nominee, so they have to say a bunch of things to make Democrats happy, and then they're running in.
Kyrsten Sinema. She was a Green Party lefty, and she won. There was nothing that was forcing her to. She was voting wildly out of step with the people in her district, which is part of why she decided ultimately not to run for re-election.
Well, right. No, but then when I'm saying when she's a general election candidate in a swing state, I think she felt pressured politically.
We're not talking about a primary versus general pivot.
Well, that's the pivot.
We're talking about a pre-election versus post-election pivot. Not the differences of your framing or posture when you're a Democratic Party candidate versus a general election candidate, but a foundational shift from the kind of core Democratic, frankly, policies on immigration, for instance, that you say that you were committed to. Going from singing the praises of the words on the Statue of Liberty to saying, I agree. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify what he said, but basically agreeing with the Republican negotiations on some pretty draconian border policies from the perspective of Fetterman. From the perspective of Democrats, draconian border policies, that strikes much more, I think, at the heart of the idea of a voter betrayal.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, to me, Fetterman seems annoyed with progressive activists. Kyrsten Sinema seems like she, on some level, just got along better with the Republicans in Congress. And I think Joe Manchin was just contending with the fact that his state voted for Donald Trump by like 40 million points. And so he needs to say no to some Biden policies to stay in office.
And yet, when you do that and you're not even choosing to stay in office, it suggests that there's other things that...
Wasn't even going to be enough because the state is plus 40 Donald Trump.
Right, but if you're not doing it for electoral reasons, at a certain point, one has to start asking questions about what your motives are and whether or not it is a betrayal to the people who did vote for you as a Democrat.
Our political figures' motivations are to stay in office and enrich themselves at all costs, just up and down the board, right?
All right, well, we'll see if there are any voter consequences for John Fetterman for these actions, and if it actually helps him to do exactly that, to stay in office and enrich himself at all costs. Stick around. We're rising for you right after this.